You're walking in the woods and you find yourself lost. But what's that? A house in the distance? You stumble towards it, hungry and cold, wanting more than anything to be out of the elements. You knock on the door. And who answers? It's us, the Pod People, America's premier horror podcast, all alone out here in the woods. I'm Matisse Van Rossum, and I'm plump and firm and delicious.
I am Ben Sheets, the rotund treat boy.
I'm Cleveland Mosier, and I'm just a bit of yesterday's bread, or perhaps a crumb of cheese. Why, there's more gravy than of grave about me.
From the bottom of the ocean to the deepest, darkest depths of the forest, we're back with a brand new review of the brand new film from director Oz Perkins, Gretel and Hansel, starring Sophia Lillis, Samuel Leakey, and Alice Krieg. And I don't feel like I need to give you the summary because you've probably heard the fairy tale before, so
Yes,
you know what's going on.
A take on the classic Grimm's fairy tale.
Yes, a dark reimagining.
A very grim one.
It does do a bit of its own thing. You know,
does.
there's a reason it's called Gretel and Hansel instead of Hansel and Gretel. Obviously, it's much more focused on Gretel and her coming of age.
Yes, it is a classic coming-of-age tale. Yeah, so as we mentioned, this is from the director of The Black Coat's Daughter, Oz Perkins, which we have talked about on the show. Cleveland and I really love that movie.
Yeah.
I know you're slightly less hot on it, Ben,
But I thought it was pretty good overall.
yeah. So this is a movie that we've been anticipating fairly well, and this was a weird one. Not what I was expecting.
It wasn't what I was expecting either, that's for sure. But we can get into it.
Before we get too far into the details of the movie, I just want to quickly mention our theater experience.
Yes, let's get that out of the way.
Because that might play into a little bit of our opinions of the movie. I'm
Yeah.
sure, even if it's subconsciously. This may have been the worst theater experience I've had since the time we had to leave Happy Death Day to You because of the jackhammering.
Yeah, I cannot ditto that
Same
enough.
theater.
Ironically,
Yep.
in the same exact theater. Like, not only like the theater, it's
cursed.
the same multiplex, but the same literal theater.
I at be hallowed ground.
Everybody in this movie was fucking obnoxious.
People talking, like,
Yeah.
people were taking pictures.
Yeah, there were literally more than once people fucking taking photographs, like, with the flash
There were
on.
multiple
Constant
accounts of people just standing up in one spot for a solid minute and a
and
half.
just standing in front of the screen. Constantly people talking, laughing.
It was obnoxious
This
as hell.
this crowd was fucking rough.
And on top of that, too, the audio was messed up. There were a couple of loud moments during the movie, like where it peaked, and the lows were muddy. It was like, I think that like some of the speakers had blown or something. Like it was really hard to hear the audio. And it was like, if this theater had been silent, it would have been like difficult enough. But with people chatting over it, there were times where I could not hear what they were saying, like over the people and over the poor audio quality. And it's like, for a theater going experience, it's just not,
not good.
It was really frustrating. So like, I really want to see it again already, just so I could get like a more like fair take on the film, because it wasn't fair to the movie. Like, it's a hot bummer because
One of the pratfalls of seeing a PG-13 horror movie opening weekend, you know, in
on a
the
Saturday
late afternoon, you know.
Yeah, you get a PG-13 crowd.
Yep.
And
a lot of
definitely got that.
A lot of teenagers. In
And
the
it's
audience,
funny because this
obviously.
movie definitely isn't catered towards that crowd per se. I mean, I think that
No,
that
absolutely
horror
not.
crowd is much more accustomed to jump scares and active participation in horror movies, which, I mean, if you're going to do jump scares, you want active participation, but that's not this movie.
which
No.
is interesting because like this film hits a fun, like, or I thought it was fun, but I could also see it not being fun, middle line. This movie does a lot, and it's like, it's pretty constant and like not action-packed in the traditional sense, but there's usually always something macabre and stylized going on during the film.
Well, it is definitely heavily stylized.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you would describe it as almost action-packed because I found a lot of it very boring.
I would agree 100%. I think structurally it lends itself to being kind of boring too, with a lot of the big horror set piece sequences being followed up with Sophia Lillis, who plays Gretel, waking up, which kind of undercuts
a lot of waking up from dreams, which I think
I didn't hate.
Is not terrible at first, but it becomes tiresome. I think
it becomes a motif where it keeps happening over and over, lessens the effect of it for me overall.
Yeah, I found this movie to be a really good atmosphere piece. I think the style is insane. It was gorgeous. One of the most beautifully shot movies I've seen in a long time.
Stylistically, that stuff is probably the best part. That and the score I thought was pretty solid.
Which I'll take a moment to bring up. Music by Rob.
Last scene in Amityville: The Awakening.
Yeah, music by Rob. We saw that in the credits, and I was like, where the fuck have I seen that before? Where have I know we've talked about on the podcast. Where have I seen music by Rob?
It was very funny. Like the credits are very like stylized and old timey, and you're getting like all these like eclectic sounding names, and it's all very like eclectic and spooky, and then just like music by Rob.
And
it's just very out of the blue.
Long-time listeners will remember from one of our very early episodes when we talked about Amityville: The Awakening.
Yeah, this has been pre-Cleave Day.
The origin of Raisin Boy.
The origin of Raisin Boy and music by Rob. I did think that the score was one of the stronger aspects of this movie.
Going off of the visuals, though, while I think it was one of the best elements of the movie, I felt like a lot of it was style over substance. And on top of that, it really kind of felt like Diet Witch territory, where it was having a lot of the influence of the witch without really
without committing
to it. You know, they didn't really commit to the period dialogue. They would go in and out of accents throughout the movie. I noticed the British accent went in and out for
the little boy, the little boy especially. Yeah.
And I think the PG-13 element hurt that part as well. I think at its core, though, this movie felt like the studio had its hands in it. Because I feel like this could have been a better R-rated horror movie that was kind of cut down to PG-13.
I think
added things to make it more clear.
I think they could have leaned in a little bit harder to the macabre and taken the R rating, and I think that this is a case where, unlike Underwater, the PG-13 rating did hurt it a little bit, at least for me. It still got more gruesome at times than I was expecting.
Yeah. One particular set piece.
Can I throw in my piece on that?
Absolutely.
All right. I got the vibe that like we weren't getting a witch kind of movie. I don't necessarily think that the witch has like all the real estate on period piece horror. I think it's a very good period piece horror film, and it's very subtle, and it does everything that it does perfectly. But this movie, I don't think it was trying to do that. I think it was still trying to be like a children's fairy tale horror movie, and that's a very different objective than trying to be the witch.
I don't think Ben is saying that the witch holds the real estate on period piece horror films, but if you were to say that this film was not heavily inspired by The Witch in terms of its style, then I don't know what to tell you.
In terms of naturalistic lighting, in terms of long takes, in terms of
pacing in a lot of ways.
In several ways, yes.
And I mean subject matter. It's a witch movie.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I mean, it's not to say that The Witch is the only way to do this. And I think that as a fairy tale kind of story, this works pretty well, but it does still feel like it's wearing so many of the influences of The Witch on its sleeve, but like Ben said, diet.
And I think you posed an interesting idea there, Cleve, where you mentioned, you know, this movie is catered as a kid's fairy tale.
Right. It's a dark reimagining.
I think
as
the thing about it is it really doesn't have the pace to cater to that audience. It is a very slow, methodical, borderline boring movie at times, especially for kids. And if you're catering it as a children's fairy tale, that doesn't really convey itself through the tone of the movie.
It's very much like a fairy tale for adults, but it still has like the structure of a child's fairy tale. It's very sort of unspecific in a lot of its events. There's large jumps in time. There's characters that, you know, serve only a sort of metaphorical purpose and then are gone. The Huntsman being a great example of that. And I think that in terms of like capturing the way a fairy tale feels, it does a really good job of that. But it's kind of weird that it's trying to be a fairy tale for adults, but still kind of has a childishness to it.
The whole crux of the movie is Gretel's coming of age.
Right, exactly.
So,
she's going from being a child to a woman. Yeah.
I will fully agree. Like, I think that this film does strike a very strange chord, and it does sort of muddy its demographic. Like, demographically, the appeal for this is very odd because, you know, it's framed and shot like something like The Witch, like you say, like very adult, like themed horror film that gets, you know, like it's all about the meticulous like quality of the dialogue and, you know, but the artistry of it. Like this looks like an artistry film in every respect, including the plot. Whereas the plot is very fairy tale. It's very PG-13, and I fully agree with that. I really like that about it. But I think that who else will like that about this movie? It's a very small amount of people who will also like that about the film.
The other interesting thing about it is I feel like a lot of the accessibility stuff that's in the movie that makes it feel more fairy tale-esque, it felt like that was put in during post. You know, the voiceover, the strange beginning sequence where she's telling the story being in a different aspect ratio than the rest of the movie really screamed reshoot to me. Having the zombie ghoul come out felt like just a scare they added in, as it didn't really have relevance to the rest of it.
Right. It introduces them to the Huntsman, but there are many other ways you could have done that. That was a kind of weird thing that I was expecting to have more relevance in the greater story, and then it didn't.
What I'll say about the Huntsman sequence, I liked it because it helped us frame the rest of the world a little bit, and we saw that they're just in a fairy tale world. This isn't like a witch situation where the whole narrative could pretty well almost feel like it was set during a specific time in American history. Whereas this movie, you get the vibe that there are like dragons and ogres and other like strange dryads and naiads out there.
Which is fine, which is not my problem with this movie. I will say in comparisons to The Witch, like my problem is not that it isn't more realistic and gritty like The Witch is. Like the fantastic magical elements of it, fine. That I don't have any problem with. I think that's honestly some of the more interesting stuff.
I almost wish they did more.
Yeah, I kind of do too.
I feel like one of the biggest problems I have with this movie is a lot of the times it's so style over substance that it feels a little pretentious, where the movie seems like it has more to say than it really is saying at any point. It's a very simple story overall, and they don't really go as in-depth and really flesh things out as much as I would want.
Yeah, well, it also, like, you know, it starts with, like, a traditional kind of, like, fairy tale voiceover, like, gather around children, I have a story to tell you. You know, this may scare you, but it has, like, a valuable lesson in it, a lesson that may save your life.
They're, like, direct references to, like, a darkness, which is like, very mythological.
I didn't ever feel like the movie actually did have a message, and to start with the film saying, there's a lesson to be learned here, and then what's the lesson?
The lesson is women's empowerment, coming of age.
Right, and I mean,
That's the thing. That's the thing. That's the exact point.
Yeah.
That's an idea, but they're saying nothing about it. They're stating what the theme is without really delving in.
I mean,
too
that's
much.
what allegory is, though, right?
Allegory is not just referencing something.
Yeah, allegory is that you make your point by using a different story, not by saying this is what it's about and then telling the story. That's not allegory.
Yeah, well, and also it's not just referencing coming of age. It's having something to say about that.
Yeah, well, you don't think like becoming a witch, like that is like a good like allegory for like womanhood?
I just felt like it was underbaked for so much of the movie, and a lot of the heavy lifting for that stuff was
once again, I will go back to The Witch and say that is also a coming-of-age story about becoming a witch, and it says so much more than this movie does.
Well, yeah, and a lot of the heavy lifting story-wise in terms of that stuff is done in the last act, in the last 20, 30 minutes, to the point where it feels underdeveloped for the rest, and then just thrown all in at the same time to the point where it almost feels a little silly.
In The Witch, like, Thomasin comes into herself because she doesn't have a choice, It really feels like she is making her own way and making her own decisions, and that's what makes her ascension at the end kind of triumphant. She is, like, truly bucking what is expected of her as a young woman in the 1600s, whereas in this movie, like, the witch is many times just straight up saying stuff like, I know things that most people think women shouldn't know, and you don't need no man. It's like, you could do that way more subtly than just saying it. That it takes the allegorical aspect away from it, and it just says, hey, here's an idea, do what you want with it, rather than let me say something about this idea that I'm positing,
Yeah, like that's where I would agree. I think it was like heavy-handed about it, but like it did say something, like it wasn't
What did this movie say about coming of age, in your opinion?
I think that it gets into the idea of not having any agency over that. She starts by trying to buck that, like societally, with the old lord.
Creep.
Yeah,
the old Harvey Weinstein lord.
She continues to like sort of like resist like that part of her life, like to not become like her mother. There's a lot of like themes about motherhood in that, like where her brother sort of represents that caretaker role, and that she sort of has to become that. The witch, of course, gets into that, and her story is also about that as well. I think there's plenty enough to say about motherhood in that film, and how that's like foisted upon us, and how it doesn't have to be. Even though the witch had like bastardized that, she was able to reshape that positively. And essentially become like hopefully a good witch.
I think the seeds of all of those ideas are there. I don't feel like it's
like said straight up in the dialogue, like when she's talking to her about her brother, and like like you're essentially a mother to him, and you don't have to be, and like all that.
Stating it doesn't say anything beyond that. That's what I'm saying. The seeds are there, but they're not given room to actually grow into something that feels meaningful or like something that is worth taking away from it. I think the idea that you're getting at of what motherhood means is an interesting one that I would like to see more of. That, Gretel is kind of a de facto mother to Hansel, but that her own mother is just like cartoonishly crazy in the one scene that we see her in. And then she has this sort of new mother figure of the witch who like cares about Gretel but is evil, and it's like all of these things are there, but I would really like to see some kind of more meaningful development of those ideas.
I would too, and I think that there's a wealth of room for that movie to have developed those things.
I agree.
Like in the fashion The Witch did.
I agree.
But I don't think that was the core intent of the film. The movie was just trying to tell a fun fairy tale movie. I'm thinking it had those themes there, and it did like still tie a ribbon around it at the end, but it wasn't about that. It wasn't about the ribbon.
That's interesting that you mentioned that you thought they were trying to tell a fun fairy tale, because
I had fun with it.
Well, I think it definitely gets into fun territory in the last act, but I feel like it's so heavy into the coming of age stuff while not saying much, that it doesn't scream fun to me until like it really goes wild in the end. And we'll talk more about that third act.
I think like for me, like I like there was always like something cool to be looking at. There was like visually there was always like something to enjoy.
Well,
That's the
style
crux
over
of
substance.
it. Style-wise, it's gorgeous to look at. In that sense, it is fun. The design of things are fun. The weird like triangular house and like the weird shed and all of this stuff is fun designs. The story and the movie I would not describe as fun at all. I just wouldn't. And I know that like you're a visual artist, so having cool stuff to look at is oftentimes enough for you, i.e. Hagazusa.
Sure.
But I don't think that any of the events of the movie are fun in the slightest.
I will say the third act gets a little fun.
Yeah, like I don't think
the set pieces, but the majority of the movie, I would absolutely agree.
I don't think that they do a disservice
is a little
to
goofy.
it.
Yeah.
Like I don't think like it in any way like it harms the film. The film like was seeking style over substance. Like I think it was trying for that. Like
you may be right.
Like when I watch like a slasher movie, like I'm not going in asking for it to be like a deep allegory. If it is, it's nice and it's great, but like it doesn't have to do that. And like
Sure.
I don't hold that expectation over this movie.
and that comes down to an extreme matter of taste.
yes.
Well, and I think on top of that, I think movies that tend to cater themselves to style over substance usually are brisker and less serious about their ideas than this movie felt like. I felt like this movie really took itself seriously, which is part of the reason it was such a slow burn. And I almost wish it really leaned into being, fun style without taking its time as much.
Yeah, I think you can do a dark reimagining while still capturing a sort of childlike sense of fun.
I mean, a
fairy
great
tale.
example of that is Argento's work.
Yeah, that is a good example.
He does essentially fairy tales. Look at the original Suspiria. It's a very dumb movie in a lot of ways. What it's saying isn't smart. It's definitely style over substance. But the thing is, it takes such a pace. There's a sense of camp to the point where you're not overwhelmed by the quote unquote substance of the movie.
I think that's a really excellent point, because I think of the style over substance films that infuriate me the most, i.e. most of the works of Nicholas Winding Refn, and those movies I hate so much because not only is nothing happening, they're also extremely slow. You're absolutely right. I've never really thought of it that way, that if you're gonna do a film that is mostly style, then it should be quick enough that it doesn't have time to get boring.
Give me a plethora of style.
Interesting. Because like one of the small critiques I had for this movie was I felt like the cutting was actually a little quick and like they were trying a little bit too much. For instance, there's a sequence when she's dreaming. I think it's the first time she's walking down the staircase into the white room. Her coming down the staircase is done in like 4 different shots. And like one of them is a behind the shoulder shot where it's like tracking her head movement. Then there's like another one where it's like we're getting a close up of her face on the other side, and then we're panning out as well. And then there's a final shot of her coming down the stairs, and it's all in like just a couple seconds. 4 like very different styles of shooting. And this movie like has a few sequences, mostly earlier on, where there's like shaky cam, which I thought was very weird.
It was,
and like
those body cams.
Yeah,
almost.
body rigs. There's a lot of that in this movie. Honestly,
sometimes it was really cool.
I like that.
That's
It was only
I
like
didn't mind that.
there was only like
I didn't mind that
once or twice like I didn't mind it when she was coming down the stairs there, but like when her and her brother were running like early on in the film, I was like, "Is this a Bourne movie? Like, what's going on?" And then it didn't really get that bad ever again. But there was like once or twice. But
I like the body rig stuff.
Yeah.
My point is it was giving us like a big feast of imagery the whole time. Which
That's for sure. I mean, I feel like we've been spending a lot of this time so far being critical of the film, and I cannot stress enough that, goddamn, is it so good to look at.
It looks really nice.
The set design and the cinematography.
The production design in particular is really stunning.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous.
Incredible. Yeah. And I mean, even the obviously like post-color grading they did and stuff, like everything is highly saturated. I thought it was gorgeous.
The one minor critique I have
you and I
on
talked about
the
this.
style of the movie, while I think the production design is great and the cinematography often is great, a lot of the shot compositions have the subjects in the middle of the frame.
There's a lot of
and
symmetrical
a lot of
stuff.
symmetry, and that paired with monochromatic orange throughout a lot of the movie, I felt like at times it wasn't the most engaging because you're just looking at one spot in the screen without moving your eyes much because everything is happening right in the middle. You're just looking at one spot and everything's happening in that one spot. There wasn't quite as much variety as I would want. The shot compositions themselves were good. I almost wish there was more variety.
In that instance, I'm going to disagree with you. I actually really liked the symmetrical shot composition, and this is coming from someone who is hypercritical of Wes Anderson, and I don't really enjoy his work very much. Yeah. Maybe if it was less childish and darker, maybe that would do it for me. Maybe that's why I like it in this case. But I actually really like a lot of the symmetry, and weirdly enough, I also liked how much headroom they gave the characters in a lot of the shots. That's kind of a traditional film school no-no. They always tell you to not give the actors a lot of headroom.
Yeah, I like that too. It reminded me
I actually really like that in this movie.
It really makes like the forest feel like it's looming over them.
And but even inside too, you know, and like the light is so stylized and largely one directional. It just like really gives a lot of interesting negative space to have that much headroom above the actors and the shots.
Well, I love when they break the 180 too, like after her and her brother like eat the mushrooms in the woods.
Oh yeah, we should
mushroom
talk about
scene
the
is
mushroom
great.
sequence.
Yeah, like
it
it was great how like that's as far as they took it. They did this back and forth between them, and then the brother runs past, and the only thing they really play with is time for that. And you see the bars and how they look like trees
And sound, yeah.
Yeah.
There's no really psychedelic visuals.
Yeah.
They don't go midsummer.
It's not full midsummer.
I really appreciated. It's a
yeah.
little more genuine, like, and I thought that was fun.
I really liked that sequence.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of fun. I actually, yeah, I do kind of like the headroom. It reminded me almost of the movie The Farewell that came out last year. They played with headroom a lot in that. But in this one, it really emphasized the ideas of isolation and especially with the aspect ratio. It was a fairly squarish aspect ratio.
I think it was 4:3.
It was close.
Yeah.
If it wasn't exactly, it was very close.
Which, once again, we've been talking about a lot on the show, how many movies are all of a sudden doing like 4:3 aspect ratios. This is an instance where I thought it worked.
Yeah,
I noticed it immediately, but I didn't mind it.
It made it feel claustrophobic. I do want to mention once again that the opening sequence when she's retelling the story
of the girl in the little pink cap,
very much anamorphic widescreen, which was kind of jarring for the rest of the movie. I didn't mind the boxy nature.
Yeah,
of the...
I think another reason they might have gone with that aspect ratio is they use a lot of extremely wide angle lenses, like so wide that it starts to fisheye around the edges of the frame. And I mean, I love a good wide angle lens. And I think that part of the reason they might have chosen to do it in a 4:3 aspect ratio is because if they had done it in full aspect, there would have been a lot more of the fisheye warping around,
especially
the
during the
edges.
body.
Yeah.
The body cam shots.
I get the impression that they did that to sort of cut off the most warped part of the frame, but so you could still have like those really stunning wides.
Yeah. And I mean, there's times when you can do that and it works, like see The Shining.
Yes.
You know?
Or The Pilgrim. I mean, it just does it so well.
I was about to say, when you don't do it right.
Right, then you get Pilgrim.
But yeah, that would make sense.
One thing that I want to mention, because I think that it's important to qualify why I thought parts of this movie were boring, because I don't mind the pace. I do mind a little bit that there's not a whole lot happening, but so much of the movie feels like very dreamlike, especially because she's constantly waking up from dreams. Is it a dream or was it not? But, it's playing with time and stuff with like the hallucinogenics and all of this stuff. It's very dreamlike, and I think that that's fine. I think it handles a lot of that stuff quite well. My problem is, surprisingly, I think the direction in this movie was kind of bad. And I like Oz Perkins. I think the direction in The Black Coat's Daughter was really good, but I feel like this movie was kind of badly directed, especially the actors.
Oddly enough, I wasn't a huge fan of Sophia Lillis.
Me either.
In this film.
And I like
Gretel.
her, and I like her a lot in It Chapter 1 and 2. Like, I think she's one of the better young actor performances. Like,
I think the directorial choice of trying to emphasize the flatness of her delivery.
Everybody is so flat. That's my problem.
That's sort of Bressonian.
Like the only characters we get that have like a great deal of style to them and like are a lot more amped up are the creepy lord, because he's style as hell.
He's great. Yeah,
like he's super like medieval picture booky. Like the oh yes, I'm so evil.
The over powdered face with like the blush on the cheeks
and like the weird like
stuff.
mirror framing next to him, like with the candelabras. Like, God, I love how that shot. But anyway,
he's only in that one
and the
scene,
mother, and like who's really wacky, like crazy with the get out of my house with the axe.
And I think,
and then everybody else, you're right, is very like understated, and they feel like they belong in that world more than like our focal characters.
The only character that I feel like the kind of understated aspect works for is Alice Krieg, who's the witch.
She's great.
I thought she did quite well.
Yeah, she's compelling. I really enjoyed her performance.
Everybody else, I liked how understated and not over the top she was, because you expect the witch character to be the kookiest, and how she kind of wasn't was somewhat refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like it did feel a little flat to me, and she's definitely nowhere near as good as the witch in Troll 2.
I mean,
like that's really the best witch of all time.
But who
frankly.
is?
No, JK. I thought she was great.
But yeah, I thought everybody else was really bad, and I think it's
it's understated and dry. And I'll agree. Like I think that our Gretel and Hansel were a little hard to relate to, and I don't think the movie needed to change anything, like you were saying with the pacing. Like I think starting them out needing to leave their home, like we know the story, that's fine. You're right, but like during some of those scenes, if we'd had a little bit more like emotion out of them, we could have like sympathized with them a little bit better and related with the characters. Well, I'll agree with that.
I was really trying to figure out why I kept finding myself so bored, because like I said, I think the pacing is where it needs to be, and usually boredom comes from a slow pacing and uninteresting action. But I really think in this case it's just because I could not give a shit about the main character.
I'm gonna sound pretentious as shit right now, but it reminded me a lot of this French director Robert Bresson.
Oh wow!
Well, he's known for having very flat delivery. He emphasized to his actors, don't emote at all, don't express at all. And the idea is the stuff going on in the movies is so contemplative and thought-provoking that it doesn't matter.
It's supposed to wash over you.
Yeah, exactly. Where this movie, where the flatness isn't paired with that. So it just feels flat for no reason.
I agree. We're supposed to be worried about the little brother, like when he like kind of disappears in the dream and you don't know like which one. I liked, but like
I kind of like him disappearing into the dream.
Yeah, like he's sort of like he takes the role of the princess in the tower in this, and like Gretel is supposed to do what she can to get him back. Yeah. But we just don't have an opportunity to know him well enough or to feel like he's anything other than like young boy who need help.
And he's a bad actor. He's a really bad bad actor.
Or at least he was, he wasn't well enough directed. Like, I liked his fake teeth. I thought that was kind of fun. Like, he had like the grungy like peasant teeth. Like, clearly he was wearing a piece for that. And I think that might have been part of the problem, is that could have very well affected his delivery. And there were a couple of factors at play.
His problem is that he is obviously a British actor who's being told to do an American accent, which once again I think is an interesting and somewhat misguided choice. And he could not do a convincing American accent. Consistently.
Yeah,
at
his
times,
accent was
his accent was extremely inconsistent, and I just like. For a movie called Gretel and Hansel, like, I should fucking care about Gretel and Hansel, god damn it. And that kid was just a bad actor, but I can write that off as him being a child. But like, Sophia Lillis is a good young actress. We have seen her be good under good direction.
Yeah, we've seen her emote.
And in this movie, I couldn't give a shit about her because she doesn't emote at all, ever. I'm not even saying I need her to talk more. I'm not saying I need her to have more lines of dialogue, but her face is just always completely monotone. She doesn't,
and
like, I think she smiles twice in the goddamn movie.
Going back to the Robert Bresson thing, it's like, I'm okay with flatness if there's things to contemplate or the actions happening in the movie are super thought-provoking.
If the flatness is a stylistic choice.
Well, here's like the thing.
I think it was a stylistic choice. It just didn't have the weight to back it up.
Well, here's the thing. The movie starts with the kids being like thrown out of the house. Things are already terrible for them.
Right.
Like, whereas like in the original tale, like they're just going out to get food. I believe like their mother is sick or something, and like they're just trying to help their family. And there's still like a chance for them to go back and whatnot. Like there were more stakes in the original children's fairy tale.
That's the point of the trail of breadcrumbs, because they're doing it so they don't get lost, and then they do get lost and then find the witch.
Yeah. Whereas like in this one, like they don't have an objective to get back to.
No.
And
they have a vague objective of going to find like these foresters so they can work and make some money, but it never feels like that's where they're really trying to get, and that the events of the movie are hampering them from getting there. It doesn't feel like there's an end that they're trying to reach,
which I didn't hate, because that does give us the setup and allows them to be at the witch's cottage longer. I think that's fine. Like, that they don't have as much of a reason to want to leave, because them having more motive to leave would have made us like them even less. Like it would have just been the whole like get out of the spooky house situation. Right. And fortunately, like the film is sort of saved of that a little bit.
I really like the idea of like the witch trying to sort of adopt Gretel and like teach her to like use her inherent power that she has as a woman. And like I think that is interesting. I don't think it's handled the best.
I don't think it's if we just had some opportunities. The sum of witch powers in this movie is Jedi Force powers.
Well, that I'm okay with. But before, that's a whole nother can of worms. But just to put a wrap on the emoting aspect of it, if we just had a few moments like worked into those scenes of just the kids being a little bit happier. We just had some sweeter moments. Like if I'd had something to enjoy about them to be taken away, I would have been more concerned for them. We would have just been a little bit more like worried like for these characters.
And I don't feel like Gretel is ever torn between like this temptation of power and like caring for her brother. Like that's what we're told by the film that she is torn between, but you don't see it. She just seems flat and miserable the whole time.
They don't do the work to back it up.
Right. And I think that the idea of the witch trying to sort of like draw out Gretel's power and like, you know, induct her into this witch coven or whatever, I think that would have been way more interesting if it seemed actually appealing to Gretel and she had to be like, well, this is the potential that I have, but my ultimate responsibility is to my little brother who I love. And I don't feel that emotion from her ever. That was a big problem for me.
Yeah, if we'd had something to be taken away.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so sorry, your point, Ben, about
Force powers.
Yes, well, the entirety of witch powers that she's taught is just force powers and moving things with her mind.
Yeah. Now that
I wish there was more variety in that.
We get a little bit of the like potion brewing. I liked that
and the tree
stuff.
sequence. I really like the tree.
I like the
bit
tree
a
sequence,
lot.
too.
And what I'll say too about like it being like force powers is I will totally agree, but that's largely because like Star Wars plays off of like the Campbellian like mono myth. It's all like coming from the same source. The movie is trying to be like an old mythos style where, you know, the hero has to like learn some sort of magic. And I thought that was fine, that it was like the Force, because the Force is like that. Like, it's the same principle.
I didn't mind it until the climax sequence.
Oh, I loved it.
That's where it broke for me, and I'm like, this is fucking silly.
I liked
silly.
the silliness.
I like the silliness too, honestly.
The sequence where like the witch like first teaches her to like control the, like, it's not a broomstick, but it seems to effectively serve the same purpose.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, but yeah, at the end where it's like she's chained to the table and like Hansel's about to get
It's
into
some
the
Palpatine
cage
shit.
to be roasted, and she's just like reaching for the broom across the way.
She's going for the lightsaber. I loved it.
That was too much for me. That was too much for me.
I thought it was great. I wanted more of it. Like,
I wanted more of it because I felt like it didn't match the tone of the rest of the movie. I wish the rest of the movie
like,
was more
there's ghoul. There's
silly
like a ghoul
that.
at the beginning. I think
The
I
ghoul
think that
didn't do
funny-
anything.
Yeah.
He got shot in the head. Like through
Yeah,
the head.
exactly. He
Like,
got shot in the head immediately.
If you're gonna establish ghouls, then give me more ghouls.
Yeah, give me ghoul action.
Yeah.
The most frustrating part of that, to me, in all honesty, was my favorite sequence of the movie was
Probably the same as mine.
when we have the dream sequence of her in the white room and the faucet is
Yes.
blood coming out of it, and it turns into like a dress as she comes, the witch comes out of the blood.
The young version.
yeah,
of
the
witch,
young
yes.
version of the witch.
it's like a reverse of Wizard of Oz. Like,
That scene was fantastic.
yeah, and she
I
takes all the
loved that.
guts
it's so good.
and pours it on the table, and
then how she goes back as an afterthought to like a barrel and like pulls a child's arm out of it to add to like this pile of guts, and then turns them into the food that they've been eating the whole time. That sequence was fantastic. I
And-
thought it was the most grotesque and the most evocative.
Amazing
and
that was PG-13.
The spooky. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was the scene where I'm like, okay, this is surprising for a PG-13
yeah, it's like
movie.
viscera and gore like all over the table. Like a kid's arm.
That's
like,
why I'm saying that I think the PG-13 rating hurt this movie,
Mm.
because if it was R-rated, they could have had more of that shit.
Well,
and
and
that shit was awesome.
if that's what you're gonna show me as like what witches can do in this world, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's fucking
Give
cool.
me more variety than just fucking Jedi mind power. You know, like that is so much cooler. And I know she's just learning how to be a witch, and it's the very beginning of that stuff. But still, there's
You could have shown
so
us
much
more
going
of what
on there.
You could have shown us more what the witch herself is capable of.
Yes,
like Sophia Lillis is
absolutely.
learning, so she's doing the basics. But I would have liked to see more of what.
And that's
Alice Creed
by
was
far
was
my
capable of.
favorite sequence in the movie. And I loved it so much that I just was wanting more of that.
You know, as much as I will say that it is a little frustrating, the sheer number of dream sequences in this movie, I think that the sequences themselves are largely quite successful.
Yeah.
Just the fact that she keeps waking up and it ends up being a dream is what I found a little bit tiresome. But even like the first time she goes down into that white room in the dream and she sees the table with like the children's bodies covered up, and they keep whispering, "Don't look at us." And then she goes over and grabs the cloth and it turns red with blood. And then she wakes up and realizes that she's had her period and like gotten blood all over the sheets. That was great.
Yeah.
I thought that was good.
I feel like
I
it's
liked
one of those
everything about
things-
the dream sequences because like it played into like the how the magic functions, and like the sort of the twist.
It's
into
not
the film.
inherently the problem that there's so many dream sequences.
I think it's very
just-
Lovecraftian.
It's just the repetition of every time there's something spooky, waking up from a dream.
I think the problem
that's kind of
literally
a tired horror
comes
trope.
in the structure of showing the shot of her waking up. I mean, look at Suspiria, for example.
Yeah.
Like the original Suspiria, there's a lot of dream sequences where you're not shown directly that it's a dream sequence, but from the events of what's
Yes.
going on, you can infer
That
that
it's a
without
dream.
literally needing to see, oh, she's waking
Without
up.
every time
it must
it
have
gets-
been a dream.
Without every time, like, the spookiness is about to climax, that it smash cuts to somebody sitting up in bed. I agree
They
with you.
even play with the idea of the line between reality and dream states in such a weird and interesting way that to have her literally shown waking up every time lessens that and weakens that in a lot of ways.
I think that it would have further enhanced the dreamlike quality of the movie and the disorientation of losing time and stuff if it hadn't shown her waking up every time. It being a dream is not the problem inherently. It's just that that's such an old, tired horror trope of something scary happening and then cut to the character waking up and, oh, it was all a dream.
My thing about that though is like we're already in like a high fantasy environment where like dream things can just happen. If we didn't get that, then there wouldn't be any way to tell.
Exactly. That's not a problem. I don't
think
mind
it's because
that.
like the character needs to know. Like that's the
No,
Well,
like-
the
like, 'cause
character doesn't know. That's the thing. She says,
Well, no, but she
you know,
just-
at
she
a
finds
point
out.
she thinks, you know, I think this is a dream, but I don't know.
Well, here,
you know?
let me offer an alternative example. We'll just take just about any number of the dream sequences and say instead of them cutting from the dream, you can still cut in the same place, but instead of it cutting from her sitting up in bed and being like, just a dream. Sometimes even the voiceover saying it was just a dream. If they had cut from that to like her sitting at the breakfast table or something.
Okay, yeah.
Then that still gives you the impression like, okay, it was a dream, but it's not explicitly saying this was a goddamn dream that she's just waking up from. It jumps forward in time and it still creates the same effect without the repetition of that same tired trope.
Yeah. Or also if those dreams had also been in wide.
I wish they played with the aspect
Yeah, I think if
ratio.
they done more of
If you're gonna have a different aspect ratio at all, then make it a theme and do it multiple times instead of just once.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Why don't we break into like the little twist? We find out that the beginning story, the opening sequence where
The
we
girl-
see the
the girl in
origin
the
of
pink
the witch.
cap.
Is we learn that the girl in the pink cap is not the witch. She was the daughter of the witch. I loved that because they played in this idea of Gretel having sort of been imbued with this story, like that
Yeah.
they had this sort of this connection, you know, and that there's sort of like a psychic resonance, and that she had sort of received it wrong. You know, like hadn't been picked up properly, and that the child is the villain, but
Well,
really
yeah, it's
the
like
villain.
a game of telephone.
Yeah, and
Well, the little girl was still the
villain. Right.
Alice Cree
The
even
witch.
says, she even says,
my
like,
bad.
I even hated my own daughter because she was evil, and then
Sorry, poor phrasing.
and then I decided to eat her and become a witch myself. I guess. Okay.
like, I loved that. Like, I think it gave her like a lot more life, and like not necessarily like relatability, but it did like humanize her more.
I think it's interesting. I think that it is kind of undercut by the opening sequence, and allow me to offer an alternative, sort of going off of Ben's suggestion that opening sequence was a reshoot. I didn't think of that until you mentioned it, but I think you might be on to something. Because if I look at the rest of the movie without the reshoot, without that sequence, that opening sequence of the story of the girl in the pink cap, it is mentioned enough in the movie and represented visually in a subtle enough way that I think you could do easily without that opening sequence, and it would be far more interesting.
Absolutely.
Because you have this idea of this story that scared them as children of the girl in the little pink cap. Hansel keeps wanting to hear again, and Gretel says, no, I'm not telling you again, because it's gonna scare you and you're gonna start seeing things. And she says that, and we get the little visual representation. There's always these hooded figures in the woods that have like the same kind of hood shape as like the girl in the little cap. And I think that stuff, and we even see her in dream sequences a couple of times, like the sequence where Gretel is in the Lord's house and all of the children are in the mirrors behind her, and she sees the little girl in the pink cap in the corner, and she goes to touch her and her head falls off. I think all of that would have been so much more evocative without the introductory sequence, because then it's like we have this vague idea of what this story is that scares them so much. And then finally, when Alice Krieg reveals that the girl in the pink cap was her daughter, and it's not just a story about this witch that we're seeing, that would have been a much more satisfying and interesting resolution.
I think it
than
would have been
having it at the beginning.
I think it would have been more substantial.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
I think that personally, I enjoyed the opening sequence a lot.
I liked the way it was shot. I liked the content
I loved
of
the
it.
style of it. And
I think it hurts the narrative
substance, yes.
overall.
Yeah. And I'll agree with that.
I mean, I think that the enchantress figure who with the black veiled face and like the broad brimmed hat and that like weird triangular structure that she's sitting in on top of the hill, thought all of that was very cool, dope to look at. But I do think that it hurts I think it hurts the story a little bit. And I think that's why you're onto something, Ben, that it feels almost like the film was shot originally without that, and then in test screenings, people were like, I'm confused. What is the thing about the little girl with the pink hat? What? And the studio's like, all right, Oz, you need to make this a little bit clearer because people are not getting it.
Well, and the fact that it's the only thing in a different aspect ratio does not scream intentional as much as I wish it would. The other thing I think that might have been added a little bit, sprinkled in, was some of the voiceover. Some of it works for me, but I think a lot of it explains more than needs to be explained. I honestly think I would have appreciated this movie more if it was more obtuse and had less voiceover overall.
Generally, I would fully agree. Most of the time, I can think of several examples where direct voiceover hampers a film. Blade Runner's a great example of that. But in this circumstance, I think it enhances the style of the film, being that it's like a children's fairy tale, and I feel like the story is being read to me, like in her narration. I thought it worked.
I agree with you. I think there's a little bit too much.
My
I think
question,
that's what Ben's saying.
My question too is, do you think that stuff, if not all of it, some of it was added after test screenings in post?
I think some of it. I don't think all of it. I think that as a stylistic decision, having voiceover in a film that is a fairy tale story is obvious. If you're trying to make a fairy tale, you do voiceover. I think that makes perfectly good sense. It did feel a little bit too explicit at times, where it's like, we don't trust you to quite understand what's going on, so I'm going to tell you about it. I'm not advocating at all for the removal of the voiceover. Just use it a little bit more sparingly, and I think it would have been more effective.
It's one of those things where, since this was released by fucking Orion coming back after a decade, I feel like the confidence of like your A24 isn't quite there.
Yeah.
They're not confident enough to trust that their audience is smart enough to understand that shit.
And I might be misremembering this, but didn't A24 produce and distribute The Black Coat's Daughter?
We can check real quick.
I don't know for sure.
I might be making that up, but if that is the case, I would not be surprised if you're right. Like, A24 is, as far as I'm concerned, like just about the best production company out there right now, because like anytime I see A24 in front of a trailer for a movie, I can pretty much be guaranteed that I'm going to enjoy it. They are very much about like letting artists make their art on their own terms, and I respect the fuck out of that.
It was not A24.
It was not A24? Yeah, okay. Well, I loved it like I love
But
an A24
nonetheless,
movie.
you know, they had the confidence to...
My point still stands. Who did produce that?
It wasn't
Zed
Orion.
Filmworks. It was very, very...
Zed Filmworks, never heard of that.
So it wasn't Orion is the point. So like your point still stands.
Right, yes,
Tease.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's not a knock on Orion. Orion did produce the new Child's Play.
Yeah, which I thought was great.
Which I liked a lot, but also very different
Very
films.
different, you know?
Very, very different films.
I wouldn't say the new Child's Play is in intellectual...
Or particularly artistic or restrained film. No, none of these
Yeah.
things. By the way, Cleveland, quick sidetrack. Did you recognize Alice Krieg? You of all people?
No.
She's the Borg Queen.
Oh my God, you're right.
I was gonna say you of
Yeah.
all people.
Oh, shit,
of all
you're right.
people.
She is the Borg Queen.
She's the Borg Queen. Yeah.
All right, well, so here we go. Time to red letter media all over this podcast.
Here we go. What have I done?
Sorry, well, yeah, you let it out of the cage. We could have gone without doing by the way, in Star Trek a bit, but here we are. Yeah, actually, the Borg Queen is one of personally my least favorite things about Star Trek. I think she's great. Like, I don't think that she's the problem about it. She's very charismatic and fun, but that's not what the Borg call for.
Sure. I'll take your word for it.
The majority of the Borg in Star Trek are a hive mind collective entity that like come out of the darkness of space to make you like them. That's terrifying. Once you put like a queen behind them or like a singular entity that can be killed, it makes them way less scary. And they don't until much later on. I think it's either in the movies or in Star Trek Voyager where we see like her appear. She's great. Like all of her scenes in it are very well worth watching, but it does kind of hamper like how cool the Borg are. She's very fun.
I'll take your word for all of that, but I will say I agree with you in principle. I have not seen it.
The Borg are rad and Lovecraftian and spooky, and that's cool that she kind of tries to assimilate her in this. Very fun.
Do you guys have any other specific instances you want to talk about, or should we rate?
I'm good to rate.
Yeah, I can say my bit during my rating.
Well, why don't you start then?
Okay. I think that you guys are right about like style over substance. I think this film is very much so that. I think it does style extremely well. It is a little hampered like in the substance department, and there are plenty of films that do give you both.
The Witch, The Lighthouse.
The Witch, Lighthouse.
It Follows.
Yeah, or even like the good cut of Blade Runner. Like there are
Blackcoat's
plenty
Daughter.
of examples. Of those types of films. The Blackcoat's Daughter is a great example. But I don't think that I do like favor one over the other, even though like I am an artist. I have a great deal of love for both.
Sure.
But I do not feel I need both to have a very enjoyable film experience. I can be very, very happy with one or the other. There are plenty of examples of dry, like visually stunning films that I love because they're well written. But in this case, I thought it was fine because it's trying to tell a monomythic, like children's fairy tale with a spooky aesthetic. Where, it is kind of hampered is in like some of the acting and delivery. We don't get enough emotion out of our Gretel. But beyond that, for me, it was a very minor thing. I think I need to watch the film again. So my rating is going to be more tentative than it usually is because of our horrible viewing experience with some people talking during the movie. It was
Taking pictures.
It was extremely distracting and it was constant. Yeah. Like I felt like I was being gaslit. So my rating's very tentative. I'm going to be watching this film again. Honestly, like I loved the style of it like so much. I had a wonderful time, like in spite of the audience around me. I'm still going to give it a 4.5. Like I really loved this movie.
Wow.
And I recognize it for its problems, but for me, what it did for me was very good. And y'all are welcome to any other opinions. I don't think that people are wrong for not liking this movie.
I will say that I don't think that style over substance is inherently a negative thing. I think in many instances it is, just because like I there's something that I can look at that is like very nice to look at, but if it doesn't speak to me on a level other than its technical mastery, then it feels kind of empty to me. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this movie is that. I definitely think that the style takes extreme precedence over the substance, but god damn is it good to fucking look at. Like, the real heroes of this film are the cinematographer, the production design team, the art team, all of that. They knocked it out of the park. Like, I would be hard pressed to think of a film as beautiful to look at as this movie, maybe since something like The fucking Lighthouse, you know? And I will happily watch this film again to enjoy the beauty of it and the aesthetic. But man, the acting is just leaves so much to be desired, and I really think it's a direction problem more than anything, because
we've seen her.
We've seen these actors before give good performances. You know, I think that this is an example of bad direction, and it hurts me a little bit to say that, because I do like Oz Perkins, and I do think that, like, The Black Coat's Daughter was one of my favorite films of the last decade. This one was a bit of a disappointment for me. I still enjoyed more than I disliked, but marginally. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5, I think.
Argento, this is not.
No.
You know, I appreciate style over substance. You know, fuck, I'm one of the biggest defenders of Suspiria
on the podcast,
you know,
or just over like style movies.
Like,
on the podcast.
I appreciate style in movies, even if the movie is dumb as hell. What I have a problem with is this movie had a lot of interesting things going on, especially in the style department. And I almost feel like I rate it more harshly because of that. Because, you know, it had so much things going for it that, like, to fall on its face and act like it had something important to say when it was really fairly hollow in, you know, what it was trying to say and the execution of the thematic material, it just really left me empty. I like both of you, you know, I really like the look of this movie.
Oh, thanks.
And you know, the score was good, but overall, like, it just left me empty, and I felt like this movie was compromised by the studios. I feel like if you took out a lot of the voiceover, if you took out the opening intro cutscene, if you trusted your audience to connect the dots, it would have been a more interesting movie.
And
you know,
deal with a dreamlike film.
Yeah, give me a more obtuse film. But as in the state it's in right now, I'm gonna give it a 2 out of 5. I'm not a fan. I'm not a very big fan of this one.
Before I give our average rating, let me ask you guys this, because I think that this film suffers a lot of the same issues. This or Hagazusa?
Oh, this.
Honestly,
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree.
This is no student film.
For me, it's less dramatic. They're closer.
They are close.
To me, it's close. But I would say that this is slightly above Hagazusa.
Yeah. I feel like this movie tries so hard to be accessible that the ideas of this movie are more within grasp than Hagazusa, where you have very little to grab at in terms of
Hagazusa is definitely
ideas,
more boring.
You know,
I still really like Hagazusa.
Go listen to our episode about Hagazusa.
You know the drill.
All right, well, that will give Gretel and Hansel a average rating of 3.2 out of 5 pods. We are recording this on opening weekend, so we don't have stats for this yet, so we will cover that next week. But we do have the results of our predictions for The Turning.
Yes.
So, Ben, please.
Okay, so for The Turning, Rotten Tomatoes score. Tease, you predicted that it would get a 45 on Rotten Tomatoes. Cleve, you said 22, and I said 32, and it ended up with a 12.
Hey.
Holy shit!
So Cleve,
wow!
Yeah, low balling for
number
the win.
3 for you.
Yes.
And in terms of box office,
Bring it to
Tease,
me.
you said 13 million.
Okay.
Cleve, you said 3 million.
All right.
and I said 8 million.
Yes,
And it ended up getting 7 million. So I get that one
Nice.
for
Well
my
done.
first point.
Well done. Nice.
So
You finally got one.
1
Ben's
point
on the
for me,
board.
2 points for Tease, 3 points for Cleve.
We're not counting bonus points.
Not
yet,
yet,
are we?
not yet. At least for that one, you know.
Well, yeah, 'cause
we'll
Cleve-
count it if there's a tie.
Okay.
You know.
All right. No predicted ratings for this one because we did not.
We
go
do
see
have
it.
early Rotten Tomatoes for this one, if
Oh,
you want to
for-
hear them.
Oh no, I meant for the.
Oh, we do
turning.
have predicted ratings, but like we haven't seen it.
We haven't seen it, so
doesn't
yeah,
matter.
it's a moot point. Yeah, let's not do anything for Gretel and Hansel just yet. We'll save that
Okay,
for
sure,
next
sure.
week. Speaking of next week, next week is Cleveland's choice.
Yes, it is.
And he has been keeping us in deep suspense about his next choice for literally months now.
Yes.
So, Cleveland, please illuminate us. What film are we going to be watching and talking about next week? I'm dying to know.
Gentlemen, without further ado, next week we will be watching the Sentai horror film starring Mark Hamill, known as Guyver.
Whoa.
We're going to be watching a Power Ranger style horror movie.
I have literally
I've
never heard of this
this.
film. Wow, this is
Yes.
Usually Ben and I are the ones on the esoteric bullshit that
I went
Cleveland has
deep,
never
boys.
heard of.
I went
this
deep.
time the roles are reversed. I've literally never fucking heard of this film.
It looks awesome. It's like if the Power Rangers got their suits from like Lovecraftian means.
That sounds
it looks
dope.
nutty. It
That
looks
sounds dope.
It looks like nutty as hell. And
Wait, have you seen it before?
I have not.
Okay, so you know
I have
about
no
it.
idea if it's
Interesting.
any good. That's what one of the reasons I'm really excited about is I've always wanted to see it. I've never had the chance, and now we all get to see it.
Okay, we're looking at the letterbox. It's from 1991, and the tagline is part human, part alien, pure superpower.
Yes.
Awesome.
Get
yeah,
high, boys.
Fuck. I have
right.
absolutely no idea what to expect from this.
Not disappointed?
I mean, I think it's a little bit too early to say, but certainly not what I would have guessed.
No, that's maybe the last thing I would expect.
An extreme deep cut. So tune back in with us next
Also,
week.
I want to note that the film is directed by Steve Wang and a gentleman named Screaming Mad George.
Yeah, who the fuck is that?
Get hype. He has no other backlog of films.
I cannot imagine why. All right. Yeah, so
excellent.
next week we'll be talking about The Guyver, a Power Rangers horror film starring Mark Hamill. That should be interesting.
The term is Sentai, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Not to be confused with hentai. We're not watching a hentai horror movie. Don't get your hopes up or down or whatever.
Notice me, Sentai.
Nope.
Well, before we sign off for the evening, it's time for a word from this week's sponsor.
That's right. We didn't have one last week. Yeah, this week is brought to you by. I mean, I had a sponsor and then I lost the paper. Let me see if I could find it real quick. It's brought to you by the Force, the spectral space power that moves in us all, and I hope it moves you to do a good deed this week. Do something nice for somebody. Let the Force guide you, and or your witch powers, whichever it is. Let it guide you to do something good or witchy. Don't eat your kids.
Are you telling me this episode is sponsored by midi-chlorians?
No, it's not. It's sponsored by the Force, and those are two different things. Damn it!
George Lucas would beg to differ.
It's sponsored by mythological powers, not by some sci-fi buzzword bullshit. That's what this episode is brought to you
Hey,
by.
I mean, last week I had a high midichlorian count and it gave me horrible diarrhea. So,
All right, well, that'll bring us to the end of this week's episode. If you like the show, do the thing that we always ask you to do if you haven't already. Go on to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're currently listening to this, and if you have some stars that you can smash as many of them as there are. 5, 10, whatever.
More like midi-borians. Because they're boring.
Shut the fuck up.
I will.
You can follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod and on letterboxd.com/PodPeoplePod, where you can find a list of all the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those episodes. You can follow me on Twitter at Deep State Aussie.
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Sheets.
And I'm occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studio as we continue to develop our wonderful horror, sci-fi, mythological, electro-fantasy game.
Midichlorian.
Nope.
Bullshit.
It stares back. It's on. We're on Steam, and we're having a great time.
Gearing up for the next chapter release. What could it be? Stay tuned to find out more.
Indeed. We got time, but it's coming.
Yes, definitely. All right,
Some
well,
nice polish on it.
thanks for listening. As always, stay safe out there, and
Get ready for the Guyver!
And don't take candy from strangers.
that's right. Goodbye.
Bye.